Hey everyone.
Hey,
Hey,
Michelle.
Michelle.
How's it going?
Hey, good. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you again. Yeah, I think the last time we saw each other is Denver, right? And
I
then a
know,
bunch of
yeah,
kernel things in the
I-
meantime.
yeah, it is. I am missing all those in-person connections.
I know, me too. I'm waiting for the next conference. I know there's a couple of people of us going to ETH Portland, and then ETH Amsterdam's coming, and then I think something in Miami, and I'm like, it's so hard to travel so
yeah.
often.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I was thinking about going to the Bitcoin Miami thing. I think it's just next week, maybe for a day or so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally. So, and then NFT NYC is in June, and Consensus is also in June. And I'm just like, I need a break. I need to stop feeling like, not FOMO necessarily, because it's like you can learn all these crypto things online, but I think it's sort of like wanting to see people again.
Right.
I don't know what your like work schedule and stuff has been like, but I've been basically remote for like the last 1.5 years.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like miss people that are like below the shoulders.
Yeah. I totally feel you. Yeah, the time I go to East Denver feels like remind me how awesome it is to see people in person.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's some people that I've been like talking to in the Web3 space and Twitter from like for like probably like 5 or 6 months before East Denver, and like when I met them in person, I was like super surprised how like tall they were. I was like, oh my god, that was like the main thing for me. I was like, wow, I didn't realize that you're like this tall or like this shorter. Yeah, I mean I'm pretty short, so there's not a lot of people that I would consider like this short, but yeah, mostly taller.
That's funny. All right. Hey, Michelle. Yeah, welcome to our podcast, our kind of the last one during KB5. We were just talking about some of the video you sent about the egg, kind of how we ending the kernel, just the beginning of the journey of a more longer path going forward. And I saw you were very involved with several NFT projects and AkiyaDAO. And would you like to talk about all your projects that you're working on?
Yeah, honestly, I probably have too many at this point, but I'm more than happy to. I'll first talk about AkiyaDAO. AkiyaDAO is a Japanese ecovillage project that basically a couple of friends and I were following the IKEA situation in Japan for quite some time. And so Japan is actually going through a real estate / housing crisis where there's about 12 million vacant houses that are in the rural side. And by 2030, approximately 1/3 of Japanese homes will actually be empty. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of older people that are in the countryside, and when they need medical care, they move to urban environments. And then basically like a lot of these houses become abandoned. And so they're kind of just like sitting there, and the Japanese government is like, wait, it's just like sitting there, there's no one taking care of it, and there's going to be also a very large cost in terms of renovating them or refurbishing them or even like destroying them so like the land around it can regenerate properly. And so huge stipends, even like to expedite the purchase of these houses as cheaply as $500. And we're thinking like, wow, there's a lot of NFT projects that are selling JPEGs for more than $500.
Right.
Like, what happens if you can buy an NFT that allows you to like basically go and live into this home for a certain amount of time, and be able to share it to others, learn about Japanese culture, and meet a lot of other cool nomads that are interested in like learning how to home build, learning how to like live off grid. I think there's been a lot of like call back to nature in that regard. And so we're like, okay, like let's start fundraising from an NFT. And of course, like it's not just like me and my friend Will who thought about this project together, like dictating like who goes where, but we're like, let's turn it into a DAO or a collective action project. So that was very much the inspiration behind the idea. And now it's like in the world, which is kind of crazy to think about. So that's one of my projects. And then very briefly, some of my other projects involve biosensor art, as well as sustainable fashion, using a NFT like authenticator part. So yeah, a couple of broad strokes there. I don't know if we want to dive into any of those or go deeper into AkiyaDAO.
I love the new catchphrase you have. Everybody asking when token, nobody asking when Japanese eco village. So.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, those are the real questions. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, like, oh, like excitement. And I think I personally am very excited about crypto and Web3. But I think what is really interesting for me is how do we convert all of this connection that we have, we were talking about this at the beginning of the call, connection that we have online, and transfer some of that into the physical medium. And kind of like, I think right now there's a lot of digital that isn't able to integrate the somatic part properly. It's like you kind of like, I don't know, if I'm on video for too long, I like start dissociating because I'm just like talking to a screen. But I think that's a lot of like all of my projects actually focus on like hardware and software integration. So I'm very, very interested in that bridge.
I'm curious what brought you to Kernel? What was your journey here?
Yeah, honestly, one of my friends did Kernel, and he's really intentional. I think that there's a lot of building, that people are working on in the Web3 space, and it's super, super exciting. But I think the cool thing about Kernel is that it focuses on the negative space. So there's a lot of positive space, which is like, like let's make something happen. And then the negative space is like, wait, let's take a step back and actually figure out what we want to build and how we can actually make more intentional systems. So I think the cool thing about Kernel, what I've seen is that there's a lot of negative space that allows for that positive space to grow in the right ways and more intentionally.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of those kind of a chatting group or Discord channel like I go to, people asking when token all the time. It's like so much a focus on the hype and the short-term stuff. It's like when you're building something physical, like we'll have a long time to getting the return. Like a lot of those called Web3 community end up just not excited about that. They don't invest in there. They don't really want to get in there too much because they feel like you are not going to make the return anytime soon. That's the kind of, I feel a lot of struggle with connecting physical space with this Web3 part. Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you have any take on like how do you engage with a lot of those social media or community when they ask you things like that? How do you normally approach that?
Oh yeah, we've gotten a lot of questions actually about that. Like, hey, like how do we measure like returns on the NFT, or like how do you hype up the NFT so much that people actually want to come? And I'm just like, actually our goal is not to like we're not optimizing for liquidity here. We're not optimizing for like the highest amount of NFT sales. The cool thing about having a structure like this, where like some of the funds come from the NFT to actually build physical things, is that if we only get like 5 NFT sales or 10 NFT sales, we're just gonna buy like 1 or 2 houses. Like that's cool. Like I think that would be definitely more ideal and definitely more organic than selling like 2,000 NFTs and like being like, okay, well, how do we like, take this money and properly seed it back into the house? But we're definitely more optimistic for like, hey, like how do we grow using a community first perspective and have it be truly organic, in the sense that like, yeah, like we're thinking of like not even having like a liquidity token, for example. That's been a pretty like high point of debate where we're like, okay, well, liquidity tokens allows for whales and people that are like have a lot of crypto capital to actually come in and like purchase these things to actually like go into buy the houses. But I think that especially if we entangle like liquidity with governance, for example, that becomes really tricky, where it's really hard to preserve the cultural cohesion within people that don't necessarily have financial access or financial needs. And yeah, I think what you had said around short-term cycles versus long-term generation is especially important due to climate and also for eco-villages. And so, like it's a whole bottle of like, it's a whole can of worms to go down the like, okay, well, short-term gains, optimizing for short-term profits, and not necessarily thinking about long-term consequences. The study of ecology is essentially about the study of consequences. And I think that like we as a DAO want to have the essence of feeding back into the long-term and taking things slowly, even if it doesn't necessarily draw on like loads of investment early on.
I'm curious how the coordination and logistics layer of this works. And will you and Will have to go physically to Japan, or you can
we'll be
okay, got it.
Yeah, exactly. We'll be in Japan. We are currently coordinating with a few locals actually. So one of my friends in Japan, she's a local there. She's actually gone through the process of buying an IKEA and like purchasing these homes and converting it into like more livable communities. And yeah, like she's like, yeah, like I have the Japanese government on speed dial, like in terms of like being able to sort out a lot of the logistical things. Me and Will have very, very limited Japanese language experience. And so we also want to definitely involve the local communities in order to also make sure that we're integrating our culture properly versus just like coming in, buying houses and totally siloing ourselves from like the rest of the environment. We also still want to integrate like with communities and be like a regenerative effort in that way too. So definitely having locals involved. And yes, we will be going to Japan to answer your question.
Sounds exciting. Who's gonna be doing all the renovation stuff? Like I guess when you buy those old house, normally it's a bunch of those property management type of work or repair need to be done. Are you also offsetting that to the locals to do that?
Locals and also people that like, especially for the first couple of cohorts, including Will and I, like we'll actually be doing a lot of the construction and renovation ourselves. There's an interesting model, especially in hostels where like, for example, people that work in the hostel get like free living situation and free like food situation. And we're thinking about doing something really similarly where like you're effectively like wolfing, but like for a house construction project and coming together and like say like, hey, like, how do you build, you know, off-grid solar infrastructure? Like Will's working on that in his other company. So I'm like, all right, cool. Like we got that down. How do you build like permaculture? How do you even think about woodworking? Like are all those things necessary? Or even bringing in local artisans. There's a lot of really highly specialized Japanese artisans that have like amazing crafts like for woodworking or for ceramics. And so even having like a rotation of these as like a mini construction artist residency type situation, whereas like, yes, like you would essentially be like living for free in the house. So yeah, we're thinking about having that for at least our first couple cohorts to make the housing project at least come off the ground.
Interesting.
I'm curious to learn a bit more about one of the other projects you mentioned earlier, the Biosensor Project. There's a Biosensors in Art. How does that work?
Yeah, totally. So basically over the last year, I spent a lot of time in Taiwan kind of doing a creative sabbatical. And there I was experimenting a lot with neurotech, neurosensors. I've been fascinated about how to contribute to consciousness research, psychosomatic research, and previously I'd worked for a healthcare startup that basically integrated data from different wearables. So like from your Oura Ring, from your Apple Watch, and consolidated it into a way that you could actually learn some insights about your health. And so neurotech, for example, is a very, very niche, I guess like industry / product. Like you don't see people walking around with like neurotech devices on, although it'd be cool, but it's not yet a fashion statement. That's one of my like broad spanning like future goals, but we'll get to that in a bit. So I started just playing around with a lot of neurotech, try to understand like what was the difference between like my brainwaves when I meditated or like when I was in flow in projects, and I started like collecting a lot of brain data. And then I realized like, hey, well, data visualization is really fun after you get like all these numbers. Like what happens if we're able to integrate a feedback loop between like what happens in your brain and what you're somatically experiencing versus what you're visually experiencing. And so one of my projects, for example, was a LED light cube where I woodcrafted a cube from wood, and I put a bunch of LED strips on it, connected it to an Arduino, and essentially, I mean, there's like a longer tech stack there, but essentially like connected it to my neurotech headset. And so when I meditated, this cube would actually start pulsing blue. And so I could see like when I would be in calm states. So I had my headset on when I was like working, and I found that like when I was in flow, like the cube would start like pulsing blue, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. Or like when I felt like very calm, like I could actually see what content was affecting me. And so that was an interesting way to, I think, learn more about myself from a conscious point of view, like a very obvious visual point of view, rather than, you know, like, hey, like, am I calm or not, or am I meditative or not? And I think it's like an interesting artistic experience as well. For example, I was working with a sound therapist in Japan. I wasn't actually in Japan, we're remote. I couldn't get into Japan, unfortunately, because of visa issues and COVID, long story. But anyways, we were working on an art installation that allowed people to essentially put on a neurotech headset, grab one of these cubes, and undergo one of her sound therapy sessions as they're laying on mats. So you can actually see like how someone's brain was responding as they were listening to the session, which is like really cool. Like you're holding your brain, you're holding your mental state in some sort of way.
Brain.
Yeah. So
That's
that's a
cool.
little bit about that.
Literally an out-of-body experience, I guess.
Yeah. Exactly.
Have you heard of that project, Lucid Dream? I forgot who's the one presenting that, but in one of the pitch practice, she talking about like a competitive dream, like making an NFT from using your dreamed art or anything you had in your brain, like while you are dreaming, you had some like a really interesting hallucination, like kind of hallucination, but like some of those like really different visual arts you generate at your dream, and then he is trying to sell those as NFT. It was kind of remind me of that when you had the
absolutely
brain on.
Yeah, I was actually looking into biosensor NFTs for a while. I feel like there's a lot to figure out in terms of like, hey, how does the data stay in the consumer's wallet? But how do you also make sure that like sensitive healthcare data is not on the blockchain? Even though, like, yeah, just like a lot of like HIPAA stuff too, and a lot of like sensitive information with the consumer. But I think eventually it'd be really cool to have data in some way abstracted onto the blockchain. So there's no way to like figure out what the raw data is, have the raw data into someone's wallet. And from like a DeSci approach, like let's say I'm a research organization or consciousness organization, being able to stake my brainwave data NFT to the organization basically means like, hey, like I consent to this organization using my data, and then transferring some like cryptographic key to them so they can actually like be able to use the data, but also, like for example, like when you go into sleep labs to, contribute to neurotech research, it's like you go there, they do this thing on you, and you probably like you don't really have access to the data. Like it just stays there. So it's like if I see another project, like do I have to sleep for like 5 more days and just like mine and like be attached to like 96 electrodes? Like that's hard,
Right.
So I think there's a lot there in DeSci. I'm very, very excited about like healthcare interoperability being a thing in DeSci in the future. Like I have a lot of thoughts on the healthcare system and data sovereignty, but I won't get into it.
I'm sure you've spoken with Ali and Chris regarding Billions Health.
Yeah.
If you haven't, but yeah, I'm also a former healthcare person, digital health person. So
right,
I think it's interesting
it's a struggle
to think about the possibilities, but it's very different industries, right? Healthcare is a hugely regulated industry versus Web3, a hugely unregulated industry.
Yeah, for sure. And I would actually say that healthcare, like something I've realized over the years is, so I used to work in finance and then I worked in healthcare, and then I realized like, hey, these two industries are actually really, really similar. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of information asymmetry, there's a lot of regulations, and there's a lot of just people that like large incumbents in the space that that influence regulation, etc. But the reason why I feel like finance and healthcare are doing completely different things is because healthcare is a lot of like, it is hard to measure returns in healthcare. And if you measure it from the returns of, like capitalistic standpoint, that's kind of like how you get the system that we do now. Yeah. But if you think about like the returns for healthcare, like the best return is that nothing happens, right, to the patient. The best return is like, oh, like we
never go back to hospital.
They never go back to the hospital.
Yeah.
And for finance, it's very much like the KPI you're measuring for is ROI. So it's a very, very clear financial quantifiable metric. And in healthcare, it's a lot more loose. It's a lot harder to tie associations. And also, number two, the risk standpoint. So especially when someone's health is at risk, you are very, very precautious. It's like if the doctor doesn't prescribe an X-ray and like 5 other tests that are like have like a 10% chance of diagnosing something correct, like they're just gonna do it because they want to like save their butt, right? Sure. For finance, it's like, okay, well, you have money, and if you lose the money, you go to zero, and that's the worst case outcome. But for healthcare, it's like infinite negative, like you opt out of the game of life essentially. Okay. So it's like risk taking and also like clear KPIs, and I feel like there needs to be a much more decentralized approach to healthcare. And in my point of view, it has something to do with like, hey, if consumers own the data, then they feel more responsible for the health because they can easily track it. And then that allows it to turn into more of a consumer thing versus like, hey, I'm sick, I blame the doctor for these things that I'm not doing in my life. Like a lot of healthcare is preventative and longitudinal. So
very true. Yeah. Totally agree. We should can all see our own health data, and then you can understand your own body condition a lot better too. So, but the problem with that, you never go to hospital, you don't need to go to doctor, then they don't make the money. So the incentive this part is kind of misaligned in a certain way.
Exactly. And even from a diagnostics point of view, it's like, okay, like you have your annual preventative healthcare exam that most insurance companies, reimburse you for. But the rate at which people go to these annual exams is like super low because it's like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me, I'm not going to go. And when people actually go to the doctors, most of the time they are sick, like there's something wrong with them. So their baseline health in terms of like what like blood pressure that they have or what their glucose is or like any other metrics, like that baseline that the doctors actually collect way off because you're not actually getting day-to-day data from like their normal living situation. And so if you go to the doctors and, like there's another problem with interoperability where like if I move doctors, like none of my past historical data actually gets moved. And so if you go to the doctor and like, let's say normally you have a low blood pressure as your baseline, and then you go to the doctors and it's suddenly normal, the doctor will be like, oh yeah, you're within the range of a healthy person. But for you personally, it's actually very dangerous. And so it's like super lack of context. So diagnostics in healthcare is a huge problem.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, a lot of skewed incentives. Speaking of incentives, again, I was curious, just to wrap things up, if there's one or two things you would want to ask from Kernel Fellows to help with your projects or the wider community.
I mean, if Ecovillages calls to you, definitely join our Discord. You're gonna find our Discord link at AkiyaDAO.xyz, so you can head to that. And like we're working on some cool stuff. We definitely want to cater to communities that are like nomadic. And I think, a lot of kernel, like especially coming from like, the positive negative space. I think a lot of what I've seen in kernel is that like the community has a lot of heart. It's like a very heart and human driven. And those are exactly like the values that we want to see it in AkiyaDAO as well, like community first, organic, and like making sure that long-term ecology effects are good. But yeah, I mean, the second request is just keep vibing. Like even if none of these projects call to you, like I love the community, and I just like want to say like thanks for existing. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah,
that's a great takeaway. Keep vibing. So
keep vibing. Yeah. That's it. Just vibes, man.
Yeah. Thank you for the time, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate all the questions. I know we like went deeper into healthcare territory, but like healthcare is also like like healing of systems, and in some ways the ecology is too. So that's kind of how I've been able to rationalize my diverse interests.
Yeah, and they're totally.
Yeah.
Right.
It's all good. We got to cover two major topics, so that was awesome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anyways, thanks for your time, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.